We're coming back. Boyd Spratley's going to be giving a presentation in Las Vegas. I can't see him on the monitor, but I hope you're still present, and we'll be doing a presentation from Boyd Spratley, and then the commission will be coming back behind the table and having a conversation with Mr. Spratley.
Thank you, Jack. For the record, my name is Boyd Spratley. I'm a practicing veterinarian and rancher in Elko County, and I appreciate the Commission's tolerance in allowing me to put on a presentation to perhaps dispel some thoughts about the livestock industry, and to hopefully give a background to the contribution that the livestock industry has to wildlife and just forestry in general. So, with that, we all know, living in Nevada, that there is only about 30% of the land mass is actually private. And so it makes it a little difficult, for those of us within the state to properly, expand some sort of economic base. A lot of the private property in agriculture is in a very high quality desert alfalfa operations. Usually these are being pumped. Some of them are on gravity flow from the mountain. But I'd like to talk about the other areas in the hay production. And those would be these very unique wet green places. These are native meadows. And down through the entire Humboldt drainage, down the Carson River, down the Walker River, these are the types of meadows that we see. And they'd be called wetlands, riparian areas, whatever you want to classify them at. They're very unique and very special places. Not only is it important for the people that own these properties, for their production and for their livestock, it's extremely important for the wildlife. And we're not necessarily talking about the game species, which it does include that, but more importantly, it's, we're talking about a lot of non-game species, all the curlews, all the snowy egrets, and all these other birds that are involved in non-game species actually thrive and require these unique wet green places. We rely on the winter snowpack, as we all know. We don't get those nice summer rains during the growing season that we expect in the Midwest and in Nebraska, those types of areas. So we depend on the melt in the spring for this snow to come off the mountain and supply these meadows and these private properties. Nevada is pretty unique in the fact that we don't have a whole lot of deep plowing on an annual basis. These meadows are pretty much intact, may have been improved somewhat with seeding, but most of these meadows are the native meadows themselves and are pretty much in the same state they were early on before a lot of the immigrants came into the area. They not only serve a purpose as habitat for wildlife and for production for other purposes, they serve a purpose as a floodplain to absorb energy from rapid runoffs. In the spring, we can have those years when we'll have this big runoff down through the country, and these floodplains are actually very important in spreading out that water, slowing it down, taking the energy out of it. And with those willow-armored creeks and rivers that run through these meadows, we don't have nearly the erosion we would have otherwise. I think any Reno resident has seen this picture and realized the importance of the Truckee Meadows has very few meadows to help with that flood control that they used to have naturally. Also, it's very close to what the historic natural state would have been. These meadows, they not only absorb that energy, it's important also to act as a filter. All these sediments that come down those creeks and rivers actually spread out on these meadows, and that sediment falls into the soil, and that's how these meadows the topsoil was deposited, or that's how they're formed, was through that filtration process. But I'd like also for you to look, this would be a natural, this water has been running here probably forever down to this drainage. But let's look a little bit at these bench areas over here where we've expanded the natural agriculture that is involved with the livestock industry. Actually will go out and they'll divert water from the natural drain, from the natural creeks, make small feeder ditches and that sort of thing to expand those meadows. So as the proactive management of these private lands has increased the number of green places in Nevada, and that's a pretty important resource for the state of Nevada and for society in general. That's something that we're in a little bit of a deficit in the Great Basin for these wet places. It's also important for it's like a sponge down through these floodplains. A lot of the water is absorbed into the soil itself, and during the high runoff periods during the spring and early summer, and then that sponge will actually slowly release those waters down the stream later throughout the later part of the summer when these runoffs and the stream flows actually would normally diminish. So I would like to point out that these are concentrated production, concentrated natural resources. It's extremely important for that resource to all the wildlife, all the mammals, all the insects within the state. It's really important what happens on these private lands. And you compare that to what, we all know what happens in the uplands. Those can be productive some years, sometimes not as much. But, it depends, and the importance of the increased production from the resource down on these private lands. We have concentrated wildlife in this situation because of that water. It draws those other species in. I would hate, to lose this resource to the state of Nevada, for the state of Nevada. In 10 or 12 years down the road, we'll be writing a recovery plan for curlews and a number of other non-game species because of the loss of the efficient production of these meadows and wet places. Concentrated wildlife habitat. But it also supplies a consumable product. We're monogastrics. We can't eat grass and do very well on it. We can have a little green in our salads. But we don't do well on fiber. And that type of non-digestible fiber for us. They can ruminate. They can turn that grass, a renewable annual resource, into a consumable product that's high quality protein that is desired by the rest of the world, not just our state. We can have production and wildlife together. I think they can be synergistic. I think they are synergistic in a lot of situations. And nothing I like better than to be able to take a picture of showing wildlife and livestock in the same frame. These meadows also serve as a fire barrier, and we all understand the importance of the massive, huge, 6-digit acreage fires that we experience in the state of Nevada on some years. And sometimes there are very few green belt fire breaks where the firefighters can make a stand and stop the fire. So it's extremely important to see that actual role for these meadows. A lot of private property is also involved in these transitional habitats. They're at the foot of the mountains. A lot of the private property goes right up to the base of the mountain. And these are, Willie Malini taught me about transportation corridors and movement corridors for wildlife back in 1992 when I got put on the Wildlife Commission. So it's extremely important to have these productive areas and all the fawning grounds, but those movement areas where the mule deer will travel in the spring and in the fall. And it's important for those habitats to be available to wildlife, and a lot of them are on private property. All of our actions have impacts. There's always an action then a reaction. And one might be non-native species introduction. Cattle and all livestock, domestic livestock, basically fit into that situation. We have the production, we have the economies that go along with the livestock industry, but there have been improper grazing, and there have been negative impacts. But the same could be said for the introduction of rainbow trout, German browns, brookies. They've been a wonderful resource, the positive side, a wonderful resource in fishery for the sportsmen that enjoy angling. But the other side of that might be it hasn't done very well for the Lahontan cutthroat trout or the Bonneville cutthroats. So, there's a balance sheet involved with natural resources. And it has to be reconciled. There's always an upside and downside to any action. One important thing to remember that inaction is also a positive or a management that we've decided upon to not act at all. And failure to deal with natural succession, where we have these huge areas still, even though we talk about loss of habitat and loss of sagebrush, we have that extreme. The other extreme is that we have some huge areas of unbroken mature sage that's in the late cereal stages. And those, it's not a matter of when or if they'll burn, but a matter of when that actual lightning strike hits and we have a massive fire again. So we need to put some sort of manipulation, proactive manipulation of these habitats back into our planning process. Even the government agents referred to these areas as sacrifice areas 3 or 4 decades ago. And I think the industry has evolved for sure. You know, the government agencies have evolved and decided the importance of these riparian areas and what has to be done to effectively improve these areas. This is just an example on the North Fork of the Humboldt River a number of years ago in 1989, before they had a change in grazing practices. Okay, this is that same stream after a change of management practice, a change in grazing, where they shortened the length of time that cattle were on any given area, and they changed the seasons of use. So those types of prescriptive grazing can be of actual benefit to wildlife and to habitat and to the resource, as well as to the production, and still maintaining the production of the livestock out there. Another one on the South Fork of the Salmon Falls Creek, up in the northeastern part of the state by Jackpot. Same sort of situation, changing grazing practices, a year of being free of grazing, and then having the change of use, short-term grazing. This is the type of response that they had with that area. So there are, you know, when people submit that grazing has gotten worse, the habitat's gotten worse out there, things are basically going to pot in our natural resources, I would submit there are a lot of bright spots out there. I'm not saying that every acre in the state of Nevada has improved. I'm here to say that there are a lot of acres that have improved very drastically and dramatically. Cummins Lake is an example of an action that was taken. I was the chairman of the Wildlife Commission when the property went to the ownership of the Department of Wildlife. The upside was we're going to have a year-round fishery here. It's going to be a blue ribbon trout fishery. We're going to draw people from all over the West to come and fish in this lake. It's going to have a reputation. And now we're going to do that by not releasing the water downstream to supply those traditional native meadows on that 3C ranch. And at the time, there was concern expressed from the livestock industry that, okay, that's a good thing, we'll have this fishery, that's the upside, but the balance sheet also will say that if you're keeping the water in the reservoir year-round and having limited release downstream, you're going to have problems and you're going to have fewer wet green acres. And that's exactly what's happened. There are some challenges involved with that management of that resource for the department right now. So I'm just saying that, you know, it's just to emphasize that actions have a reaction. And we have an upside, we have a downside. All of these actions and decisions that are made. Okay, what are the contributions of agriculture to not only the residents of the state of Nevada, but perhaps the resource and to wildlife? I think maintenance of open space is one of the most important ones. We'll talk about this entire list. The expansion of those wet green places by going out with a shovel and actually moving water across different areas that normally wouldn't get the runoff except on the very highest of flood years. Rangeland improvements, tax revenues to the schools within the counties of rural areas, employments and families, contribution to the economies of those rural areas, and I would submit that family and culture do matter. There is an important part. That's an important contribution to the state, to society in general. Okay, open space, and I hope I don't show a picture of someone's individual house that's in the room. But, you know, the upside of that balance sheet is that we have nice areas for people to live, and that's desired. And I think it's something that we should support, and it's important. But by the same token, it makes it more important that we have maintenance and sustainable open space into the future. And I would submit to you that the sustainable, multi-generational family ranches are best positioned to maintain and ensure the open space that we do have. Beautiful areas. Some of the nicest meadows in the state of Nevada are in the Gardnerville area. But again, this is the very types of movement corridors of wildlife and mule deer that William Malini was concerned about in 1992. That's how do those deer on the Sierra front, how do they handle the fragmentation of the habitat, fragmentation of water rights makes them less efficient. So we're going to have fewer wet green places for the habitat, as habitat for wildlife, especially non-game species. Open spaces do have value. They do have value. I think, you know, appropriate use of the Nevada's natural resources. When we talk about expanding wet green places, I think we at least have to consider we're going to expand a wet green place where it's appropriate to have it. You know, trying to make a wet green space somewhere where it's not going to be a wet green space probably is less than desirable. So there is value to open space, and I would contend that family ranching is an important part of that equation. Rangeland health and water development, you'll see that the water tower in the background here not only serves the livestock, but the pronghorn that are standing right next to the livestock that will water there. The year I took that picture, there was actually a family of burrowing owls living underneath the trough. Nice little cool spot for them to have their home. Mule deer actually benefit from coming in behind the grazing program, an appropriate grazing program. And the new regrowth that comes behind the harvest of a natural reoccurring yearly annual production of grasses and fine fuels, that regrowth is what's desired most by wildlife. That's their ice cream. The old growth from last year, the sineast, the grasses and that sort of thing are higher in fiber and less desirable. They're feed, but the cattle are much more likely to take those old dry feeds and consume them and put them to good use, and allows wildlife to come in behind and take the new green growth. Upland range improvement, this is 2 years post-fire. You can have that kind of recovery. And I would contend that short-term grazing and changing the time of the season is what can result in these sorts of benefits to the resource. I know that if you listen to horse advocates, wild horse advocates, they'll tell you that the horses are going extinct to promote more numbers of cattle on the range. Since 1970, there have been a loss of about 500,000 AUMs in the state of Nevada. The numbers of cattle in 1984 were about 660,000, and that's the total number of cattle. The actual cow herd would be about half, about 40% of that. Now it's down to about 450,000. Those are a little older figures, but it's tough to come by some of these figures sometimes. The sheep industry, and I know sitting in this room right here, I would have a lot of debate about the importance of the sheep industry and the impacts it has on bighorn sheep. I fully understand those types of impacts and discussions and debates. I won't get into that here, but the sheep industry is almost extinct in this state, very close to being there. The financial impacts, the value to the economies in the rural areas of the state is valued, a study that was done in 2006, Dr. Harris said that $68 per AUM annually went into the local economies for every AUM. A loss of 500,000 AUMs could make a significant difference to the economies of rural and small towns and school districts, and everything that goes along with that. Okay, the ranch will have expenditures and the personal purchases by not only the ranch but by the employees of that ranch are infused into the local economies. Property tax revenues will support schools and employment of families, jobs. It's important to have jobs. Sometimes it's families, sometimes it are small families that are working for the ranch, but the family ranches really are a bedrock and a financial contribution to the rural communities. There are a lot of threats to ranching. Some of them have been around forever. These ones up on in the red there: taxes, labor costs, labor problems, labor pains, health of the owners, the amount of debt that they're carrying. All those have been around forever. Those have been traditional threats to ranching. Unfortunately, currently, regulation, we all see the need and understand the need for regulation and a litigation that drives that regulation, but I really believe our industry is starting to feel that regulation in some areas is onerous and perhaps doesn't promote and lead to the goal that we probably all sit down and agree upon the goal. So that's probably becoming the greatest threat to family ranching in the state. A wildfire threat, and I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with that kind of threat. Not only wildlife, the resource, water resources, water quality would be involved with that wildfire threat. We see things from total black spots from horizon to horizon, maybe with a little metal showing down here that didn't burn, but we'll see massive black spots without any intervening or areas of mosaic that did not burn. Literally on this right side, the cattle were pushed about an hour ahead of the fire out of that particular pasture. They'd been there for 30 days. The fire occurred at the last week of July, and we can see the difference in the patterns of how that fire carried. These two areas were about 1.5 miles apart. So it tells you that there is impact, and it can be used beneficially to reduce wildfire threat with grazing. Fire threat has some immediate losses. First, you know that the impact of these cattle are trying to outrun the smoke. Right here, that sagebrush is about 8 foot high, absolutely decadent and over mature. So those types of raging hot fires driven by about a 40-mile-an-hour wind, I guarantee are very dangerous, not only to animals, wildlife included, and humans. It's a frightening thing to experience and watch. The long-term losses, I have to applaud sportsmen who have put a lot of money into the rehabilitation of public lands, and even in some situations private lands. That can run $20 to $30 an acre. We're reseeding and a number of other things that are done to rehabilitate these fire areas. But there's also a long-term loss to the industry of closures, and so the loss of grazing during that closure. Unfortunately, in a lot of areas, you have private lands and public lands mixed together within an allotment. So those closures not only apply to the public lands, but has a tremendous impact on a number of private lands along with that public land closure. Sometimes they're 2 to 4 years long. That seems to be the ever-changing bar that we have to get over to get a reopening. But bitterbrush, aspen recovery, all those things are involved with that recovery process. But there's a major cost to the operation of either renting additional cost to rent outside pasture or cutting herd numbers, which definitely will decrease income in the future and tough to build back. Wind erosion, this is what I guarantee happens all late summer and fall after a major fire, these big black areas. We get the winds through, you see the dating on this is in mid-August, and this is after the fire season, and these huge dust storms are what result in the loss of, and wind erosion cause major problems to the resource after a fire. So these huge areas and seas of mature sagebrush are not going to be of benefit to the bird. And that's what this is all about, just talking about sage-grouse. You know, we need to have green belting. We need to have fire breaks. We need to have manipulation to keep this from becoming that 100,000 acre fire or 200,000 acre fire, as opposed to a 5 or 6 or 10,000 acre fire. Get into White Pine County, Eureka County. Here's the risk here: huge levels of burnable product that's growing right there. Major impact on the resource if it burns. It's a major impact on the resource if it doesn't burn. Those huge PJ stands have a tremendous impact on the watershed. Okay, again, these were about 1.5 miles to 2 miles apart. We have the catastrophic burn, where we even burn the green willows that armored the side of that stream. And it gets pretty hot to burn willows. And again, that same situation with grazing made a tremendous difference to make more of a mosaic and a patterned burn that may be of benefit throughout the future. So proactive manipulations are important. And to have proactive manipulations, we need to have flexibility in management. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing diminish. We're losing that flexibility through regulation. When things are written down in stone, I guarantee you that's how it's implemented eventually. It's some, depending on from one area to the next, but it does get implemented at some point. Grazing is an important part of that proactive manipulation. We do it mechanically, we can do it chemically, we can have cool season burns. Here's an example on the Utah-Wyoming border. Huge tract of private land there. You see there's still snow, no leaves on the aspen trees, and they still had a cool season burn. After that, you get that kind of response, all the edge effect, the new green up. That's beneficial not only to the livestock industry or to the owner of this ranch, but to the elk populations, deer populations, and grouse populations that are residents also on that private property. A diverse mosaic is what we're looking for. I think it's beneficial to the industry, it's beneficial to wildlife, and I would hope it would be desired by sportsmen to support that. But this is a renewable resource project funding up there in Elko County. So, post-fire adaptation. Nature she hates a void or a vacuum. And even though this particular area has burned repeatedly since 1960, sea of cheatgrass, we still get pronghorn and chukars in there, even though the mule deer and the sage-grouse have moved out. This is a private piece of land that recovered, you see in the second year of recovery. It was grazed the second year post burning, it was grazed in the fall. And still had that kind of recovery on the shrubs, bitter brush. This particular piece of private property, as we speak today, USGS has teams in the area counting grouse. This is an area that the birds have chosen. Within a mile of this area, there's a huge power line, which I'm not supporting that we, don't deal with power lines. But there's that risk. It's within a mile of the home operation, of the headquarters for the ranch. So there's mechanical and human activity. Cattle are being fed on the meadows next to the ranch. This is all within that 1 mile radius. So my point being, even though Dr. Schultz, I fully respect him for picking out things that the sage-grouse likes. Because there are some things that are not on that list, doesn't preclude them from being important and of benefit. So why has the bird chosen an area that basically has a lot of the risks are built into it? Why is that bird chosen that? We don't understand everything. We can't be arrogant to believe that we understand the entire problem and the entire needs of a particular species. I really believe, and this is a sincere, opinion from my heart, the hands-off policy is going to be cheatgrass advocacy. If we keep hands off, let the sagebrush get decadent and not intervene, I think we're going to have huge fires, and we're going to repeat those fires, and we're going to end up with cheatgrass as a consequence. I think the ranching and private ownership community is essential in cooperation with the agencies. This was a mule deer project that was done in a study a year ago in January, and it was cold. January is a tough month in Elko County. And these types of cooperations on private property are important to the agency, to wildlife, and to the ranch itself. I mean, quite honestly, most of the population within the livestock industry are sportsmen. They love to hunt. Most of the people are hunters and fishermen. Your turkey seasons wouldn't be much without private property. They depend on private property for your seasons to be successful. So how do we maintain these lands? Ranches are a combination of private and public lands. And as an economic unit, you have private lands, and because there's only 30% of private property, we depend on public lands to have different seasonal, probably on public lands in the summer, back on the private lands in late fall, into the winter, and into the early spring. If you remove one of those two components, the ranch is very likely to fail economically. If you don't have a viable economic unit, those ranches become much more vulnerable for financial problems, much more vulnerable to speculation of buying, whether it be water speculation or land and development speculation to come in and chop up these huge areas of open space into smaller units. The water rights are fragmented, much less efficient to use, and we're going to have definitely a decrease in green wet places. So how we make decisions on public lands are most certainly going to affect the resource on private lands. And so we need to find that has to be at least be a consideration when we make public land decisions. Okay, I really believe that family ranching, multi-generational family ranching operations should be a priority concern. And if we remove that family from ownership, it really increases. I guarantee it might be 5 years down the road, it might be 15 years down the road, but the chances of that ranch falling into some sort of speculation increase dramatically. How do we sustain these values? More regulation and zoning is not the answer to fix the problem. Forage and fuels management is a must be considered, and I think grazing is critical and natural, at least a part of that equation. And those decisions have to be based on good science, performance and based incentives to the landowners themselves, and determined problem solving based on science. And let's not cherry pick our science. Let's look at the entire spectrum and realm of scientific literature out there that is available to us. Flexibility is the key. And the more we have land designations and lock things up and get things written in stone, it reduces that flexibility and the potential to be innovative, think outside the box, and do things that will actually be beneficial to the resource. I hate to say it and come into the fuzzy part of this thing, but a land ethic is important. And people have always had that comment that, you know, the day the ranch sells is the richest day of that rancher's life. When you make a conscious effort to say, we're going to pass that on to the next generation, you have to live modestly and have a major commitment to make that happen, if you're not in the speculation business yourself. And that's an important aspect. These families are in it for the long haul. They want sustainability. They want to be able to do the right thing. They want to be able to think outside the box, not get locked into a small box. Custom and culture really are important. I think that society in general throughout the United States, they do have a passion for the cowboy and what we do out here in the open range. So it's not something to be trifled with. I think it's an important part of the equation. And I think if you're really a resource advocate, the preservation of the values that go along with that family ranch, a sustainable family ranch, are important. And that's a true ally of wildlife and wildlife management. And I think we're making a horrible mistake to put ourselves in a position where we lose those sustainable family ranches, and therefore down the road we're looking at less open space, fewer wet green places. We can have an honest debate, and we can find solutions in some way to make production and a preservation of a resource possible. So with that, I would entertain any questions from the commission.
I want to go back up here so I have my...
That was a little less somber than the previous part.
Yes. I believe very beneficial and something that maybe we should do more often to make sure that both sides are on the same page, working towards a common goal, and that's range health, wildlife management, the health of the state of Nevada in general. The cattlemen have a great representative on the commission, and Pete Morai. But Pete's one voice, and so sometimes maybe we don't get our message through Pete as well as we should.
Well, we're not very good as an industry. We're not very accomplished at coming in and supporting our livestock representative on this commission or getting our word out. I think we have a good story, and we get some up fairly frequently. So yeah, we appreciate the opportunity to do it and speak for the commission.
And I see mutual benefits on both parties, and I talked to you on the phone a couple times, and I talked to Commissioner Morai about this, and I recognize the high importance of the traditional family ranching and what it does for the sportsmen and wildlife of the state of Nevada. I know there's in talking to different cattlemen over the past few weeks, there's some differences with the Department of Wildlife and some things going on. And one of the major differences that I've been told about recently is Endow doesn't hold true to their commitment when it comes to elk numbers and what we put out there. And I know that this commission is thinking outside of the box, looking at different ways to manage elk and to get back into the numbers that we had agreed upon when the elk were originally introduced into some of those areas. We know we're behind, but I want it to be recognized we're working on it, and we're trying to really think outside the box to have as little impact on the ranchers and you know, we look at sportsmen and their quality of hunting experience also, and we're trying to think of different ways to help manage those elk and get back in good graces, primarily on elk.
I'd like to interject right there that what you guys did, you know, with your regulation and changes in your hunts was appreciated. We see the value what you're trying to do there.
And when it comes to trying to maintain relationships and recognizing that elk is one of those hot button issues with the cattle industry, I asked Director Walsley a few questions, and I've got some answers, and I want to share those with everybody to know what this. I know the ranchers have done a lot for the wildlife sustain Nevada, but the sportsmen, NGOs, and other people have brought a lot to the table to help ranchers in return. And what I've come up with is since 1991, NDOW has spent $1.6 million and installed 110 miles of 8-foot tall wildlife fence. I mean, that's not a little feat. 110 miles of fence, 8-foot tall, is a whole lot of fence to help protect the livestock industry and the agriculture industry. Elk damage payouts to date, $430,000. These are just round numbers and some estimates, but from 2000 through 2013, total number of elk tags released to landowners. I'm looking here, I've got a whole list of different numbers. But we're a couple thousand elk tags have been released, and at the average cost of what we hear an elk tag goes for, depending on the year and the area, you can get some fluctuation, but the landowners get compensated fairly well for those private elk tags. And at a conservative estimate, $7.4 million in elk incentive tags have been sold since 2000. So that's an economic benefit to ranching developed through wildlife. One of the main things, and Boyd, you brought it up in your presentation, we have a shared problem with wildfire. And from July 1st of 2000 through March 18th of 2014, total expenditures on seed and the application of that seed, $3.524 million. Total acres treated, 65,142 acres of private land and 88,851 of public land. So the department, the NGOs, the sportsmen see the benefit of not only seeding the private, but they're doing private, public, they're doing everything. I know that you guys are coming to the table and doing your share on this, and but I believe some of the stuff that's been seeded has had a direct benefit to the livestock industry also, and getting that rehabbed and back into condition that you can use it and it's good for wildlife at the same time. We're doing it for wildlife. I'm not going to beat around the bush. We're not doing it for the livestock industry, but we're doing it for wildlife. But I believe the livestock industry has seen some benefit in those fire rehab efforts, and it's money that NDOW has helped administer, but it's not just NDOW money. It's definitely coming from Nevada Bighorns Unlimited, Nevada Chuckers Foundation, Mule Deer, Nevada Muleys, Chucker Valley Chucker Club, Barrick Gold Corporation, Newmont, Midas NBU, the Nevada Dream Tag, Elko Bighorns. You know, and NDOW is working with all these different people to get those seed mixtures out into the best places to benefit wildlife, and in doing so, it does have a positive impact on the range for the cattle industry also. So I do believe that everything you said in your presentation should be absorbed by our commission and looked at, and you know.
I would really like to direct, maybe we can, in cooperation in some manner, we need to be looking at spending some of those dollars and in pre-suppression, preemptively and proactively going out and managing some of those big acreages of sage to prevent them from burning entirely, so we don't have that one big black spot that we have to spend a lot of money to rehab. I really think that's an important step that we haven't been pushing quite hard enough. And because I'm sure that we can all agree and actually do that together.
And I look forward to having a better relationship with the ranching industry. I think we've hit a couple bumps lately, and we're at a low point, and we just need to start looking up and going forward. So, I appreciate your presentation. It was positive, as you said it would be, and I'll open it up to any other comments. So I'll probably start with Commissioner Moore, having him be the ranching representative on the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief, but I appreciate you putting this on the agenda, because I think that it is something that we all needed to see, and that maybe if you don't see this from time to time, it's easy to forget what's really going on out in the sticks. And I think this demonstrates what we can do collectively to improve habitat for wildlife, improve habitat in the rangelands for livestock. The figures that you just gave us are impressive, of what sportsmen have supplied. One point that I would like to add to that, and it goes toward what we can do collectively, is the way I see it, figuratively speaking, ranching writes a check for the benefit of wildlife every day. And that check is being cashed every day.
It's usually in the form, it's different currency. You know, as opposed to a monetary check, it's usually blisters from a shovel. Those types of investments are what's being made toward wildlife, toward the resource, you see on a daily basis.
And I also think Boyd touched on it, was that almost everyone enjoys having the wildlife on their property, being able to view them. We're not just talking the game species. We're talking all wildlife. And that's why I think it's important for us to remember these things, and when the road gets a little rocky and we run into these bumps, that maybe we can step back and look the situation over and realize that we all have plenty to lose if we're battling.
Commissioner Drew.
Yeah, Boyd, I appreciate you coming in and giving the presentation, and I think we're probably pretty like-minded on a lot of this stuff. The concern that I've had, and why I appreciate you coming in so much, and why I appreciate Director Wasley going to meet with the Cattlemen's Association at the end of this month so much, is that a lot of these issues can get blown out of proportion. I think in a lot of instances we talk by each other. Because it's almost like high school. You either got to be a rancher or you got to be a sportsman, and you can't be both. And that's just kind of bogus in my mind. We're all Nevadans. And to address the issues that we're dealing with, we aren't going to do it through the press, and we aren't going to do it through letters, and we aren't going to do it through policy. We're going to do it through face-to-face meetings and boots on the ground and collaboration. And so hopefully we can use what I see as kind of a bottoming out as a springboard and move forward collectively, because that's the only way we're going to get it done. So I appreciate you coming in, and I think Tony and your efforts and things going forward, and Pete, your efforts, those are the types of things we need.
Anybody else?
Thank you for your time very much.
Commissioner Moore has one more comment.
Yeah, and I'd just like to reiterate another time of how much I appreciate Boyd coming in here. And when he talked to me about being on the Wildlife Commission, he told me at the time, hey, if things get rough at any point in time, we're there. And I want you to know I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Boyd, I didn't mention it at the beginning. You hit on it a couple times. You're probably the only cattleman to ever sit as chairman of the Wildlife Commission. So that says something about your character. And I appreciate what you did then. I appreciate what you're doing now. And I think you were the proper person to come in and give this presentation, because you understand both sides of the table. You understand the dilemma we sit in, sitting on this side of the table. It's not always easy. I mean,
I didn't envy it all this morning.
yeah, we take darts from every direction. We have no place to hide or nobody to hide behind. So you know what it's like, and like I said, I appreciate what you did then. And I really appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna move on to agenda item number 8B, Tag Allocation Hunt Application Committee. We had a meeting this morning. Went over the survey that it's still ongoing. One of the deliverables by the survey people is that they had to give us a preliminary update. That preliminary update, when you do a survey, you hope for that aha moment and the silver bullet that will change everything. And what we're finding out of the survey is everybody wants to hunt every year, but they still want to see 30-inch bucks every place, and they don't want hunter congestion. And it's pretty much shown us the dilemma we're in. We want something that's really unobtainable, and there is no aha moment that I was hoping for out of it. But I'm not saying it's been a waste. I don't want to go into the survey too much at this point because it is preliminary, and it would be disingenuous to start talking about too much before we get the final findings of the survey. So we'll really hold off on that portion and wait for the final findings to come out, and then maybe we'll have some more aha moments, but we just haven't had it yet. Another big topic of discussion today, and I asked that Mr. Hoyen would help get this to the cabs, and that is on our heritage tags, our stream tags, our PIW tags, all of our specialty tags, and how our process is broken, especially when it comes to sheep units, and maybe in some ways some of our deer units, specifically Lincoln County, when you have 25 PIW tags that all want to go to Lincoln County at the same time, how that can have an impact on the resource. So we've thrown out a few ideas during the Tag Allocation Committee. You will be getting to the cabs kind of a bullet point of those discussions to hopefully inspire some more discussions amongst the cabs to help us come up with solutions to the problems that we all know exist, specifically in our sheep units when it was recognized there was a problem in years past. So a commission prior to this one decided that if a heritage tag holder takes a sheep out of an area 1 year, that unit's closed the following year. And what we're seeing is 5 sheep taken 1 year, it's closed the next year. 5 sheep taken the next year, closed the following year. We've seen it in the Chihuahuas when we had a small population of sheep get hit by PIW tags and multiple heritage tags, how a devastating effect that can have on small populations. So we did throw out a couple ideas. You'll see that in the minutes, and I don't know if they're the right idea. We're just trying to get some conversation going amongst the cabs, and maybe somebody can come up with an idea. We can say that's where we need to go, and that's what we need to do. One of the ideas that I brought up today was maybe on these specialty tags, have a quota in these smaller units and have it as our lion hunting and as our bear hunting currently is. If you're gonna hunt in that unit, you've got to call in and make sure that unit's still open. And if you do harvest in that unit, you have a mandatory time which you have to report in that you harvested in that area and close that area down for the rest of the year so you don't risk having 5 taken out of the same unit in 1 year. Just different ideas like that. I'm not saying that's the right idea, but there's multiple ideas. And maybe somebody else, through the discussions with as many people at cab meetings and stuff, we can come up with the right idea. Reducing the number of PIW tags on deer. Would that have an impact on the number of people applying for deer PIW? Most people don't know there's 25 of them last year. So we're given an opportunity, but are we having an impact on the resource? We need to weigh those and figure out the right way to go. So those are a couple of discussions out of the tag allocation committee. Unless anybody else on the committee has anything to add to that, Mr. Johnson, do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, sir.
Okay. Seeing nothing on that, we'll move on to agenda item 8C, overview of wildlife harassment laws. Chief Game Warden Carl Bonamici. With the lights going out, does that mean we go to the back again?
Yeah.
Yep, let's move, guys.
That's fair.
Yeah, me too. Blood clot.
Oh, my foot's going to.
For the record, Rob Bonamici, Chief Game Warden. I was asked to give a kind of an overview of our wildlife harassment laws, laws and regulations that pertain to wildlife harassment currently that are on the books. Some issues of concern regarding wildlife harassment, chasing wildlife with motor vehicles, boats, and aircrafts. I think everybody will agree that's a form of wildlife harassment. Dogs chasing wildlife, by that I mean free roaming domestic dogs that are out chasing deer down and so forth, so we'll cover that here in a bit. Shed antler collection, is that potentially a form of wildlife harassment, whether intentional or not? Go over that. Aircraft, drones, everybody's got questions about drones, so we'll cover that as well. Okay, chasing wildlife with a motor vehicle. We have an NRS 503010. The red highlighted areas are the pertinent portions. It's unlawful to molest, rally, stir up, or drive any game mammals or game birds with an aircraft, helicopter, or motor-driven vehicle, including motorboat or sailboat. So we got laws on the books currently that prohibit the use of motor-driven vehicles, aircraft, and so forth. And it's unlawful to shoot any game animals or birds with a weapon from an aircraft, helicopter, or motor-driven vehicle. And also we have a law pertaining to spotting or locating game mammals or birds with any kind of, again, aircraft, helicopter, and communicate that information within 24 hours after the aircraft or helicopter is landed. And continuing on, it also addresses it's unlawful to use a helicopter to transport game hunters or hunting equipment, except when the cargo passengers or both are loaded and unloaded at airports, airplanes, landing fields, or heliports. So you can't take a helicopter, land on top of the mountain, and go shoot your deer or elk. Okay, chasing wildlife with motor vehicles. Person shall not kill or attempt to kill any birds or animals while flying an aircraft. A little redundant, but we definitely got a lot of those issues with motor vehicles and aircraft covered. Dogs chasing wildlife. It's unlawful for the owner of any dog to permit such dog to run at large if such dog is actively tracking, pursuing, harassing, attacking, or killing any big game mammal within the state. And any peace officer's got the authority to destroy that dog under those specific conditions. Dogs running at large addresses the actively tracking, pursuing, harassing, attacking, or killing any wildlife in a state-owned wildlife management area. So bottom line is dogs need to be under control and not just free roaming. dogs chasing wildlife. It is unlawful to hunt, chase, or pursue black bear or mountain lion with a dog except during the open season in an open management area and under the authority of a hunting license. So there are instances where dogs can be used, and they're specified in regulation. Shed antler, the commission shall adopt regulations for the taking of shed antlers. I've given presentations on shed antler collection before. The issue falls kind of in two categories. One, the intentional harassment of wildlife, which we pretty much have covered. The chasing of deer or elk through the trees to try and knock their antlers off so they can be collected. So that's one issue. The other issue is totally unintentional, no malice or anything intended towards wildlife, and that is just the overall collection of sheds with, if there's a lot of people out there, just inadvertently moving deer, elk back and forth while they're out there walking, gridding an area and so forth, if it occurs in some of their critical deer winter ranges. Okay, drones. Everybody's kind of on point when it comes to drones as far as, hey, what are we gonna do? Are they legal, aren't they? A person shall not, for the purposes of hunting, locate or observe or assist a person in locating or observing any big game mammal in a management unit described in NAC 504-210 during the period beginning 48 hours before a big game hunting season opens until the close of that season in that management unit, with the use of an aircraft, including without limitation any device, that's keywords, that is used for navigation, keyword, of or flight in the air, keyword. So that covers drones, because they are used for flight in the air. Nobody can argue that a drone doesn't fly in the air. And then we'll also cover hot air balloons or any other device that is lighter than air. And satellites are also covered in this regulation. So it's a pretty extensive, all-encompassing regulations. Quite honestly, it's one of our better regulations written for the future. This was written several years ago, and it does cover the drones. And this is just a continuation of that regulation. Some indirect harassment related, and it's unlawful for any person to camp within 100 yards of a water hole in such a manner that wildlife or domestic livestock will be denied access to such water. So it's an indirect form of harassment if we want to go down that path. I just included all our laws and regulations that are even remotely related to harassment. So any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Back behind here so we have a microphone.
Well, I hate to do this, but you might as well all state for a fact.
Before we go on to you, John, is there any questions from the commission on the wildlife harassment? Commissioner Drew?
Rob, as it regards shed antlers, since we're going to be delving into that arena here, and the aircraft provision, we talk about in that regulation for purposes of hunting, that would not necessarily apply to shed antlers, correct?
That is correct.
At this point.
Yeah, but the the reason we had to get legislative authority for a shed regulation is because sheds are not considered wildlife, or a part thereof once they're naturally shed from that animal.
Okay, any other questions from the commission? All right, Elko and Vegas still hanging in there? It's been a long day. All right. Mr. Schoberg, you're probably gonna have us get up again and do another
I
PowerPoint?
apologize, but yes, or you'll be thrown into the commission.
Okay, this will probably be our last time we sit down for a bit.
Hopefully this is Was that gonna? Never mind. Thank you. Chairman Rob and Commissioners, for the record, John Schober, Fisheries for the Department of Wildlife. We wanted to give you just a brief update and information on where we are in terms of drought conditions so far this year and how that will be affecting fisheries throughout the state, primarily in northern Nevada. Both for information now, and I think as a little prelude to some developing issues that we're assessing and maybe coming back to the commission in May regarding some specific actions we may need to take for some areas of the state. Obviously, we're all aware that we've been in a significant long-term drought that's ongoing and certainly didn't improve at all this winter. This is the most recent data and drought report from NRCS, which shows current snow water equivalent percent of normal throughout northern Nevada. And as you would expect, it's particularly poor in western and northwestern Nevada, with most basins essentially at or well under 50%, somewhat better in eastern Nevada and northeastern Nevada. This does reflect the last significant moisture that we got from storm events that occurred in late February and early March. This actually shows the water year to date for that same period. The numbers are a little better, but it's a little misleading because of warm temperatures, because of the way that precipitation came and the subsequent seasonally warm temperatures that we've had. We're really looking at a little bit of a early spring runoff situation to the extent that there is runoff. And so that does have implications for a lot of fisheries, particularly stream fisheries later in the year, because we're going to see reduced base flows during that warmer late summer, early fall period than we would under ideal conditions. Looking really quickly at some major basins and areas, kind of in summary, the Truckee River Basin, it's well below average, well below normal, and significantly below last year, which was not a particularly good year in and of itself for the winter. Reservoir storage is significantly less than last year. Depending on the specific drainage, stream flows are predicted through late summer to be down to 10 to 30% of average. We did get a little bit of a break with the precipitation events that we had in late February and early this month, because it did significantly increase storage in Lake Tahoe and Lake Tahoe Basin. And the advantage there is it will help somewhat in terms of maintaining flows in the Truckee River, at least through midsummer or so, better than what we had originally anticipated. Carson Walker River Basin, a similar picture. Snowpack significantly below average. Flows are going to be a little better, probably in the 30 to 50% range in both of those basins, at least for the main stem Carson, east and west Walkers. Northern Great Basin, northeastern Nevada is a very much more variable situation. It really varies from basin to basin. We've seen a tremendous variety in conditions there. For example, McDermott Basin, NRCS is saying they're at 7% of the median snowpack right now, whereas Upper Humboldt Basin, 85%, Owyhee Basin right in the middle between the two. There's a lot of variation in conditions in other parts of northern Nevada. In terms of specific impact to fisheries, the bright spot is South Fork Reservoir. We're looking at that probably remaining near 60 to 75% of capacity through the summer. We don't really anticipate any significant effects there on the fishery at all. As a matter of fact, that's probably one of the few areas in northern Nevada that won't see any real impacts from the drought in terms of fishery anyway. Wild Horse Reservoir, Wilson Sink, Willow Creek Reservoir are fairly significant fisheries that we're looking at some very severe impacts probably going through the summer. There's a number of smaller waters as well where we would expect to see that in smaller reservoirs. In a lot of cases, those have already been affected by the conditions we've had the last couple of years. So we've either seriously impacted or lost some of those small fisheries already. At this point, we're maintaining them just on an annual put and take basis until conditions improve. We don't expect to see on some of those small waters the fisheries to really sustain themselves from year to year under these conditions. Wild Horse, 21% right now. We're thinking we'll be lucky if it gets to around 30% capacity by the end of the spring runoff. With irrigation demand that's expected, we'll probably be down to a minimum pool of 5,000 acre feet by August. And the Duck Valley Tribe has already approached us to talk about drawing storage down to below the minimum pool late this summer. That's not something we have control over, but we've already been notified that that's certainly a possibility. We fully expect this year at Wild Horse that between the water temperatures, water quality in general, and algal production, it will be lethal to trout and probably some warm water species by mid to late summer. You will recall that the commission passed an emergency regulation to remove limits on Wild Horse last year for reasons that we can't really fully explain because the water chemistry said it probably should have happened. We didn't really have a major fish kill last year, but we fully expect to see that this year at Wild Horse. Wilson Sink is another one that's currently at about a little over quarter capacity. That will come up. It's not that large a reservoir. We expect to see probably irrigation demand to drop that down to a very minimal level. We expect, for basically the same reasons as at Wild Horse, to lose that trout fishery sometime this summer. The largemouth bass may persist. It's just going to depend on the conditions at the time. Willow Creek is the third one that we're particularly concerned about. We may get up to 30% storage. It has no minimum pool agreement. We have been talking with the water rights holders. It's a little unclear what that irrigation demand will be, but we anticipate it's very likely that we'll see critical water levels by mid to late summer and potential effects, significant effects on that fishery as well. Where we are with this right now is that we are constantly monitoring the situation for these and other waters across northern Nevada. If we don't see water storage conditions improve substantially by early May, and we have nothing indicating that will happen at this point, we likely will be requesting removal of harvest limits for game fish species this summer for those three reservoirs in northeastern Nevada. Again, if it's practical, if we have the opportunity, we will look at the ability to salvage warm water game fish species from all three waters, because we do have nearby waters that are in good enough shape. We think that we may be able to move some fish. So depending on conditions, that may be an option. We can't absolutely commit to that, but it's something we'll be monitoring and take advantage of that if we can for the warm water species. In western Nevada, conditions are a little different. Lahontan Reservoir is in a similar situation, I believe, to last year. It's at about 25% now. We expect to see that down to a minimum pool of about 4,000 acre feet by September. How that affects that fishery is going to be largely dependent on temperatures. If we get a particularly warm September, late August, September period, we could see some significant losses of warm water game fish in Lahontan. Rye Patch Reservoir is at 5%. Again, at the time that I put this together, we did not have a decision from Pershing County Irrigation District on irrigation. It appears now they probably will not be drawing anything additional out of the reservoir. However, there's no inflow either that's projected. So we've got some significant issues there. Topaz Lake is at about 13%. Again, we're in a situation where we don't think there will be probably significant irrigation demand. So it fluctuates a lot anyway. It's been low. It was low last year. We're at a pretty low level now. We don't think there will be huge additional impacts this summer to Topaz, more than likely. I think we'll squeak by there. There's a lot of smaller waters that will be affected. A couple I'll mention. Onion Valley Reservoir will probably be lost again. It went dry last year. Our approach to that has been to do minimal stocking in the spring. We did that this spring in anticipation that most of those fish will be caught out before we get into a situation where we lose the reservoir to provide some recreational opportunity. Knott Creek has a minimum pool agreement. We did have some issues with algal blooms last year, and we anticipate that may happen again, but we're pretty confident that Knott Creek will pull through pending what effects those algal blooms have on the fishery. The Truckee River will probably maintain through most of the summer, particularly in the upper river. With those a little bit of additional storage we picked up in the upper parts of those basins, at least through September or so, and beyond that, it's really going to depend on temperatures. We're concerned about the lower river, particularly below the Glendale Water Treatment Plant, because there's a good possibility that, again, depending on outflow and temperatures, if it falls much below 100 CFS or so, we could have some effects on trout downstream of that point. But we're keeping our fingers crossed, and the situation in the Truckee River has actually improved a little bit over the past several weeks. Most other rivers and streams in the western region will have low flows, but we're probably not looking at a total loss of those cold water fisheries, and most of them, again, dependent on conditions and temperatures as we go through the summer. In terms of management actions, and I appreciate the comments from Joe Crum with the Pershing cab. Removing limits is always an option, and we're not ruling anything out at this point. For both Lahontan and Rye Patch, we're a little reluctant to go forward with that, primarily because of the mercury consumption advisories on both of those waters. We're not sure that we want to be encouraging people to catch and eat more fish when we already have a specific consumption advisory for both of those. We will be looking at options for limited salvage and relocation of warm water sport fish. If we have access and the conditions are okay, and we can figure out a place to put them. So that is always an option. We have been working with the commercial harvester at Rye Patch. They removed, I believe it was 14,000 pounds of carp were removed in March in an attempt to maybe open up a little window in there and remove some of that biomass. Harvest of blackfish may help a little bit in both cases, although we don't expect to see the kinds of quantities that will really make a major difference. But to the extent that they can remove some of those non-sport fish species, it only benefits the resource in terms of the game fish. A large number of waters in both the eastern and western region are being stocked early this year. We've already started most of those waters. In many cases, we wouldn't start until April or later under normal circumstances, primarily to get those fish out to provide an opportunity for angler harvest before we get into these summer conditions. And a lot of the smaller waters, particularly streams and the smaller reservoirs where we do feel we have an opportunity to get some fish in this year, will have stocking numbers reduced 50 to 60% compared to normal to compensate for those low flows and low storage. Just to quickly mention Southern Nevada, that is a relative bright spot. We don't anticipate any major effects in the southern region from the drought, other than streams in northern Nye County and some areas like that. Echo Canyon Reservoir in Lincoln County is going to be pretty touch and go, but it always is, because of some issues with the reservoir itself. We don't anticipate any serious effects from the drought at either the Kirch Wildlife Management Area reservoirs or Eagle Valley Reservoir. Lake Mead continues to decline because of general conditions in the Colorado River Basin and decisions by the Bureau of Reclamation for storage, but it should have minimal impacts on the Lake Mead fishery. Angler access is maybe becoming somewhat of an issue if we get down to 1083 elevation, but we'll be working with Park Service as best we can to maintain that. For anglers, Lake Mojave will remain essentially stable at normal levels. And I would welcome any opportunity for questions. If you have any specific waters, I do have some notes here. Specific waters I didn't mention, I'd be happy to cover that.
Any questions by the commission on a particular water or questions in general on the presentation by Mr. Stover? Okay.
Thank you, Chairman. One that I didn't see you touch on was the Ruby Marshes. And I got a couple of questions about the marshes.
Sure. To some extent, the issues at Ruby Marsh are kind of dependent on decisions that the refuge makes and how they manage that water. We expect it to be low. We think it would be low regardless. As we get into, later in the year, I think we're going to see some issues with boat launching because of the levels. I don't know that it's necessarily going to have a major effect on the fishery itself in the long term. But there will likely be some effects on angler access.
Okay, and that leads into my next question. Are you guys involved in any decisions at all on the use of that water that's there? And the reason I ask is the marshes used to be a fantastic fishery. It still is to an extent, but I was there this year. I know several people that go there, but the north end of that was basically drained. The long dikes was all completely drained and stuff, and there were several dead fish in there, largemouth bass, and it was sad to see. And as a person who grew up out there and have tons of great memories of that place as a kid, it was disheartening to see that fishery in that state. And I know that we probably don't have a lot to say in it, but I was wondering if there's any way that in the future the department could intervene or a little bit.
We're certainly aware of the situation. We, for the past several years, have been trying to work with the refuge, particularly regarding the management of the dike units and some other issues relative to water management. It's been a little bit of a challenge, and they're currently in a situation where I believe both the manager and the assistant manager have left, and it's not clear when at least one of those positions is going to be refilled, so it's a little unclear who's in charge right now in making some of those decisions. We're working on a strategy now to kick that up a notch and see if we can get some attention from the Fish and Wildlife Service relative to some of the management decisions out there, because we've been trying everything we can, working directly with the refuge and through this winter, and it just has not improved. So we're looking at options to maybe continue that discussion at a level where maybe we'll have a better opportunity to come to some consensus.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the work that you're doing. I wasn't aware of it.
Yeah, we're on it. It takes a little while to win your way through the
Absolutely, thank you.
process. But we're aware of the problem, we're working on it.
Director Wasley?
John's being really diplomatic. We've engaged with the regional director in Sacramento, and we've been talking about having a trip out to the site. There is a water management plan out there that I believe was developed in concert with our fisheries in mind, and we don't believe that water management plan is currently being followed as it was intended to be. So we're engaged all the way up to the regional director, and we're trying to implement some changes out there.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to agenda item 8E, Sage Grouse update, Secretary of Wildlife.
Thank you, Chairman. I did want to acknowledge and thank Boyd Spratley for coming in and sharing some of those perspectives that I think for all of us to be reminded of. I'm grateful that we can have an open, honest discussion with the cattlemen, and Boyd in particular is here today, kind of as an ambassador towards that effort. I have a great deal of respect for Boyd, his family, what they do for ranching, what they do for wildlife, as I do for the Morais. I've had a number of conversations with Pete and his brother Stan, and I'm optimistic that we can work together and accomplish more together than we can separately. So that said, the sage grouse situation, as we heard today, comments were due, I think it was maybe late January on the BLM sub-regional draft EIS. The department provided comments specific to that draft EIS. That stirred up some controversy. A lot of that, I believe, is partly due to, I guess, the complexity of the planning process, and through some of the discussions that I'll be having before the end of the month with the cattlemen. I hope to gain a better understanding of their sensitivities and concerns with respect to the issue, and be able to convey some of our intentions and thoughts behind some of the comments made in that process. As we've talked about before, with respect to greater sage grouse, the governor has established a process by which there's a 9-member council that addresses these issues relative to sage grouse. They are supported by a 5-person technical team, who is in turn supported by a science work group, a cheatgrass action team. We've been developing a state perspective, a state alternative as it relates to the threats. Currently, the primary task at hand for the Sagebrush Ecosystem Council is the development of a conservation credit system. The credit system, one of the key components of that conservation credit system is what's called a habitat quantification tool, and that's allowing those who are administering the conservation credit system to go out and determine baseline status of habitat on the range, to then determine either benefits, pluses or minuses to sage grouse from that baseline condition. We're stepping up the meeting schedule, trying to have frequent meetings with the council, sensitive to the timelines. Last week I attended the North American in Denver. Part of that conference was a sage grouse executive oversight committee, and the meeting was standing room only. They had to bring in extra chairs. Dan Ash, the director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was present. Noreen Walsh, the regional director from Denver. Renlo Hefner, regional director from Sacramento. Defenders of Wildlife, Wild Earth Guardians, World Wildlife Fund. The attention is certainly a lot of people paying attention to sage grouse right now, and it's elevated almost on a daily basis. It's a very divisive issue. The service is paying very close attention to what the states are doing. We feel pretty good about the mechanisms that we have in place to address the threats out there. What it ultimately will come down to, I believe, is the confidence that the Fish and Wildlife Service has in the administration of some of the mechanisms and some of the regulatory assurances that they've said that they need to believe that there's going to be adequate measures protecting and conserving sage grouse. On the bi-state sage grouse, just this morning, as a co-chairman of the Executive Oversight Committee for the bi-state sage grouse, I submitted a letter to the regional director in Sacramento asking for a comment period to be reopened so that we'll have an opportunity to provide more comments. We've got some new science. The USGS has provided us with some new analytical techniques that originally there were 6 different population management units identified in the bi-state area, 4 of which were demonstrated to be in a status of decline. The new analysis by USGS is demonstrating that those 4 PMUs are stable, and so we're pleading with the Fish and Wildlife Service to reopen the comment period to allow us to share that new science. And we're also asking for a delayed decision. We're asking for at least 6 months for that decision to be delayed. It's currently scheduled for October, and if we're granted that delay, we'd move it till April, which would also give us more time to address the Fish and Wildlife Service's criteria, which is really centered on certainty of effectiveness and certainty of implementation. So if we can demonstrate a certainty of effectiveness of the conservation efforts in the bi-state and a certainty of implementation and certainty of effectiveness, we think we may have a shot at precluding the need to list in the bi-state. That's our hope. We have a pretty good group of partners, including the Forest Service, the BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service is at the table as well. NRCS is probably the most key partner in that area because the threats in the bi-state area are different than the threats in the greater sage grouse. It's fire and invasives. The primary threats in the bi-state are really development. So with NRCS acting to put conservation easements on some of the private lands, we're hopeful that that'll meet the needs of the service needs to see the conservation be effective in that area. I guess with that, I'd ask Vice Chairman Drew if he has some other thoughts from as a member on the state's Sagebrush Ecosystem Council, if he had some thoughts he could share.
I think Tony hit on the major issues. Obviously, the BLM comment period was a huge one, and there was a huge push to get not only review of the BLM's proposals and comment to those, but we were also kind of building the plan as we flew it in regards to the state's plan and alternative. And I think that probably contributed to some of the misunderstanding in the writing campaign. But essentially, we just at our last meeting finished bolstering the wild horse and burrow section of our state plans. Even though the comment period's closed, we continue to work on our plan. The livestock grazing portion of that was actually completed just after comments were due. So it's kind of really, we've been in a major state of catch up. Director Wadsley pointed out the conservation credit system. We did get that approved, at least the framework of that approved at our last meeting. We have not yet delved into the wonderful world of mitigation ratios, which is going to be a whole other key component, how that evolves. Our next meeting will be April 8th in Carson City. I'd encourage folks to attend if you have an interest in sage grouse and how this whole process is unfolding. I think that's one of the venues that we probably need folks from different sides of this to show up and express concerns and ideas as we move forward. And then the only other thing that's kind of lingering out there, and we haven't got a lot of clarity on it, but I'll just mention it so people understand it is in play. Senators Reid and Heller have introduced what they're calling a discussion draft of legislation that would potentially benefit sage grouse, and it's kind of the way it's formatted now. It's more or less a lands bill with some potential public land sales, designations of wilderness areas. So that's another component that's kind of in play. We haven't been engaged at this point. It's very preliminary from my understanding. We have requested that be on a future Sagebrush Ecosystem Council meeting. So At this point, I don't know if that will be on the April 8th meeting agenda or not, but it is something that's in play and we'll probably be discussing.
Okay, any commission questions? All right, I'm gonna announce it again, I didn't announce it earlier, but any of the items on informational, we're gonna hold public comment on any of that stuff until the end of the meeting during the general public comment. So if you're in Elko or in Vegas and you have comments on anything during the reports and informational items, we will be taking public comment in with knowing the time crunch we're under. We'll move on to agenda item number 8F, Department Activity Report, Secretary Wasser.
I'll try to hit the high points. Some of the items have already been discussed here today. March 12th, Incline Village General Improvement District had a public hearing pertaining to trash ordinance. They kicked the can down the road, so to speak, put that off until their May meeting when they'll have a new general manager on staff. We're still hopeful that they will have a mandatory bear-resistant container ordinance to help assist with the nuisance bear issue. And excuse me, I'm gonna bounce around quite a bit from subject to subject here, but various game division personnel have attended a number of banquets recently promoting some of the auction tags. Nevada Heritage Elk Tag sold an RMEF for $125,000. We sold a deer tag for $85,000, sheep tag for $115,000, and an elk tag at Safari Club for $155,000. So the Heritage Fund should be growing. We should have great opportunity to implement some meaningful conservation projects on the ground here coming up soon. Biologists have conducted helicopter surveys for elk, finished some of the deer and pronghorn surveys. In general, the production of young was below last year, but still sufficient to maintain populations of big game for the most part, and even allow some growth in many herds, and in at least one pronghorn herd in spite of current drought conditions. Southern Region biologists reported successful transplant of 49 wild Rio Grande turkeys from Utah to Lincoln County. Eastern Region biologists coordinated with the department's net gun contractor to mark bighorn sheep and mountain goats and collect biological samples in the Rubies and East Humboldts. This is a continuing multi-year disease surveillance study with implications for future management of Rocky Mountain bighorn and Rocky Mountain goat populations that share the habitat. It's received national attention and international attention, especially in the western U.S. and Canada, where populations of both species coexist and share similar habitats. Habitat Division staff has recently completed this winter's fire rehabilitation efforts, with over 17,500 acres being seeded during the 2013-14 winter. Accomplishment was due to partnerships with land management agencies, private landowners, and supporting sportsmen's organizations. Habitat Division staff is continuing to work with Bureau of Land Management on the transfer of 6,281 acres of public land to the state of Nevada. The property will be added to the Steptoe Valley Wildlife Management Area to benefit wildlife and public recreation. BLM has completed the cadastral survey of the property, and NDOW is continuing to work with BLM, State Lands, and the State Historic Preservation Office on a programmatic agreement that covers protection of cultural resources that may be found on the expansion property. Habitat staff is continuing to work on updating the conceptual management plan for the Overton Wildlife Management Area. Updated CMP will lay out a course of action to avoid and minimize conflicts between user groups and expand hunting, bird watching, and other recreational opportunities. Management strategies for improving the habitat for the Yuma Clapper rail will also be included with the updated CMP. It's hoped that this amendment process will reduce the number of user conflicts that have occurred over the years. Statewide water development coordination effort was conducted in cooperation with area wildlife managers, area wildlife biologists, and supporting sportsmen's groups to collectively create an annual statewide priority list. The schedule was created with the pending compliance date of October 2014 for fence replacement and signage requirements of SB 134. Specifically, the regional water development crews will be placing signs on all of the state's 1,692 guzzlers by October to identify a hotline to report any guzzler-related issues. Habitat staff has also been working on numerous meadow restoration projects, some in the Black Rock area of Humboldt County. NDOW and BLM have prioritized evaluation areas with restoration to benefit sage grouse. Wildlife Diversity Division staff provided technical presentation to more than 40 members of the Nevada Mining Association, the environmental managers that met in Reno last month on the Nevada Crucial Habitat Assessment Tool, the NV-CHAT. Presentation was well received, and NDOW staff offered to conduct hands-on technical workshops regarding the chat to any of the mining association members that were interested. The chat was developed in coordination with the Western Governors Association. It's a West-wide effort. It's a cooperative effort of 16 Western states to provide the public and industry a high-level overview of crucial habitat across the West. It's an interdisciplinary team of 20 NDOW biologists and GIS staff developed the NV-CHAT with close coordination and participation by several staff members of the Nevada Natural Heritage Program. Landowner Incentive Program, the LIP program, or Farm Bill Coordinator, continues to work statewide with private landowners, NRCS, conservation districts, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to preserve and restore habitats on private lands. A number of restoration projects and agreements are underway in Lincoln, Nye, Elko, and Douglas counties. Projects include spring restoration, habitat protection, invasive species control, post-fire seeding, and fence marking to decrease sage grouse strikes. We just had the update on the drought effects on fisheries, so I won't go through that again. Mandatory aquatic invasive species decal for the majority of watercraft operated on Nevada waters began in January, and we've seen 85% compliance for residents. Decal compliance for non-motorized and non-resident watercraft remains problematic and will be a focus for outreach efforts this coming year. NDOW will be continuing to operate 4 voluntary free of charge inspection and decontamination stations at major high-risk reservoirs in northern Nevada during the 2014 boating season in cooperation with Division of State Parks. On-ground construction work for the improvement of Jiggs Reservoir near Elko will begin this spring as soon as the empty reservoir is dry enough to support heavy equipment. Some work has already begun with NDF crews assisting with the removal of brush and other vegetation from the Jiggs Dam construction area. The work to deepen and reseal the reservoir should be completed by mid-2014. After refilling, NDOW will stock and reestablish the sport fishery. Question 1, bond funds have been a major element of the project funding. Substantial donations to assist with the construction have been received from Barrick Gold, Newmont Mining, and Elko County. NDOW is also working jointly with the BLM to renovate Boulder Reservoir in northern Washoe County to increase depth and improve fish habitat. The project also includes fencing the area, providing off-site water for cattle, creating improved camping and day use areas, installation of vault toilet, fire rings, informational kiosks, and rehabilitation of upland plant communities within the fenced area. The reservoir was drained in early March, and the project should be completed by the fall of 2014, at which time the reservoir will begin refilling and NDOW will restock with trout once the water quality and quantity is adequate. Work is continuing on the Fisheries Habitat Improvement Project in Lake Mojave with the installation of additional habitat structures and brush bundles continuing throughout the spring. Scuba surveys by NDOW biologists continue to show substantial benefits to the sport fish species with extensive seasonal use of habitat by young and adult black bass and panfish. Several additional coves have been approved for habitat development through 2015 by the National Park Service. Conditions have improved significantly at Sparks Marina Pond with the onset of spring weather. Water quality measurements taken through March by NDEP and the City of Sparks indicate that dissolved oxygen profiles have returned to normal levels and no other water quality problems have been detected. If conditions remain similar for the next few weeks, NDOW will resume stocking the pond for fishing in April. The suspected cause of the loss of the fishery in December was a sudden temperature drop which caused the mixing of bottom sediments throughout the water column as the lake turned over. Game Division Western Region biologists, along with Habitat staff, attended a Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge annual coordination meeting. Several things were discussed. One item of interest is that Sheldon is likely going to close the roads again if the drought continues. They indicated providing the 5 bighorn hunters with waivers for closed roads didn't work well because the privilege was abused when hunters brought in more personnel than permitted. Many complaints were received regarding unfair treatment. Game Division's Eastern Region biologists coordinated with Great Basin National Park to collar bighorn sheep using the department's net gun contractor. GPS collars were attached to assess habitat use patterns, survival, predation rates, facilitate collection of herd composition data, and to help identify potential habitat improvement projects. And our staff continues to work with Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, Clark County, and the Animal Foundation for proper disposition and responsible management of unwanted pet tortoises in Clark County. NDOW, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the local adoption group in Southern Nevada have created an online registration for current pet desert tortoise custodians to better facilitate tracking of pet desert tortoises. Staff is also proactively pursuing a stepped-up educational outreach program targeting decreasing numbers of unwanted pet tortoises in Southern Nevada. Game Division's Western Region biologist in Winnemucca was notified there was a domestic sheep in with a group of wild sheep in the Santa Rosa Mountains. After contacting the owner of the domestic sheep and getting permission, it was euthanized and sent to the NDOW Wildlife Veterinarian for necropsy, sampling, and disease testing. Results will help NDOW determine if there's a need to sample wild sheep in the area. Game Division's Eastern Region biologists reported private land affected by the 2013 Wheelan Water Pipe Red Crow fires were seeded in cooperation with Habitat Division, BLM, and private landowners. NDOW acquired funding to seed private lands prioritized by sage grouse and mule deer values located on those properties. Barrick Mining Corporation, Ellison Ranching Corporation, Rhodes Ranch, and the 25 Ranch allowed NDOW to seed approximately 5,658 acres with upland sagebrush forage mix and 1,216 acres of watershed mix primarily composed of grasses, sagebrush, and forbs. BLM seeded the majority of the public land consumed by these fires with similar seed mixes. These efforts are key to maintaining habitat for sagebrush obligate species, including sage grouse. I'm almost there, bear with me. Game Division's Eastern Region biologists met state wildlife department representatives from Utah and Idaho at the Tri-State Elk Management Meeting hosted by Elko County on February 20th. Landowner elk issues for herds that share borders were addressed by all 3 states. The department presented a list of actions taken in response to increasing elk numbers, including damage payments, fencing, and increased elk harvest through higher tag quotas and more hunting seasons. It was well received by the group and generally appreciated by county and rancher representatives at the meeting. Adjacent states are planning to increase hunting pressure in their respective states by adding companion hunts to match Nevada's current elk season structure that starts in August and lasts through mid-January. Nevada Department of Wildlife is processing several requests for reward payments to concerned individuals who reported wildlife crime violators, and the related cases resulted in convictions. Operation Game Thief added a report poachers web-based reporting system to allow concerned individuals to visit our webpage, www.ndow.org, to provide information on suspected wildlife violators. If you log on to our webpage, on the front page, in the center near the bottom, you'll see that link. NDOW is moving forward with fundraising to support and expand a reserve program. The reserves will also be responsible for organizing and supervising a non-commissioned law enforcement volunteer program in conjunction with the Operation Game Thief Citizens Board. Game wardens have dealt with several Operation Game Thief calls and patrols dealing with over limits of fish due to earlier than normal stocking and anticipated low water levels. Fishermen are out with the news of the recent stockings and warmer weather. Wardens have issued several warnings to people feeding big game, mainly in the Carson City area where it had been commonplace to feed the deer. The word is being spread to these homeowners and the problem appears to be on the downward trend. Wardens have been busy with field training new officers in Elko County, and wardens are looking forward to having a dedicated officer in Eureka after a 3-year vacancy. NDOW has 2 vacant game warden positions currently in Elko. That's all I have.
that's a very detailed report, and some of it encouraging and some of it discouraging all at the same time, but I think we all caught a few things on the way by that are of particular interest to us, and thanks for that very detailed report. Anybody have any questions of the report or items on it? All right, we'll move on to item 8G, traffic committee reports. Commissioner McNinch is absent, so Commissioner Drew and I will tag team this one. We did hold 2 committee meetings a couple weeks ago. One on a Friday afternoon in Elko. That was very well attended. I'd say 60 to 70 people showed up to that meeting. A lot of good interaction, and as a result of that one, there was a recommendation or a motion that passed on a 3-2 vote to keep 96 hours statewide in what we considered the rurals. Some of the justification for that was distribution of trappers, keeping the trappers out of close proximity, but also recognizing the distribution of trappers into the far reaches of the state is a prudent thing to do for a wildlife resource, so we don't over-harvest in some area and under-harvest in others, especially when we're facing red fox invasion and different things that could have an impact on some of our native species, particularly sage-grouse. So that was one item, and then we came into Reno the next day after a little mishap on the way home, but we made it a couple minutes late, and we had another meeting in Reno. At that meeting, there was another 3-2 vote on what is not a 24-hour trap check time period, but a calendar day trap check period. So there was a vote on that in conjunction with an associated map of the Peavine Mount roads down through Carson, down through Minden. Anything west of 395 from border to border is basically covered on that map in the shortened duration of trap check. That meeting was also very well attended. The demographics of the 2 meetings were different. One of the concerning things for myself is the multiple times that we have new people showing up to these meetings expressing concern over their own dogs getting caught on private property, and the trapper that caught their dogs on their own private property didn't have permission to be there. So that was one of the items of concern of mine. And Commissioner Drew or Commissioner Lane, you're both on the committee. Do you have anything to add at this point?
It's just the one thing that I would add is that the committee's more or less taken the position that all of our recommendations will be delivered to the commission at one time, and I believe we have one more meeting set for April 5th in Las Vegas to try and address some of the issues down there. So I think those are the 2 key items I wanted to bring up.
And at the Vegas meeting on April 5th, we'll be discussing a map in similar nature to the map we discussed in Reno. As I stated with the map and the calendar trap check period, those are starting points for discussion. Anything that is brought forward by the committee will have to be acted on by the commission. So I do consider them starting points. I've had some recent discussions with a lot of people since that map was approved, and that I still do have some concern in some areas. So just because the committee did vote on the map in Reno, as I stated during the committee meeting, is the starting point. due to some conflicts that have come to my attention, I believe that the Reno map could grow, and I want that to be recognized. The other thing that I have spoke with Chief Game Warden Bonamici with, and the chairman of the trapping committee, Dave McNinch, is with the number of people having their own pets caught on their private property by people illegally being there, and it's upsetting to me, and I don't like that kind of activity. And I asked that on our agenda down in Vegas that we review bonus points, or not bonus points, that's demerit points on such activity, and even consider it a 12-point offense if you are trapping on somebody's private property without permission. I don't think that's acceptable behavior in any time, and those people do not belong representing sportsmen in any way. So that's one discussion I want to have in Vegas that will be an additional agenda item. Another additional agenda item is trap visitation. Currently, if you're late on your trap visitation, it's just 3 demerit points. And it doesn't matter if you're 2 minutes late or 20 days late, it's the same demerit points. If you look at some of our other regulations when it comes to fishing and upland game birds, there's a graduated demerit point system. If you have a couple birds over the limit, you can get 3, but if you double the limit, you can get 6 demerit points. And I do believe that we need to have some type of escalating penalties for people that push it further than they should. So you will see those on the agenda coming up in Las Vegas for review of bonus point or demerit points on those 2 subjects. Anybody else have anything? Questions, Commissioner Lane?
Mr. Chair, I would say that I am proposing to present another map in addition to your map, and I'm trying to get that into the commission. I know we're trying to get it on the website prior to, hopefully by Wednesday or Thursday of next week, so there'll be plenty of time for people to review it prior to that time. I am concerned because I am worried. I'm already getting a lot of concerns coming from Las Vegas because of the decisions that were made both in Elko and Reno. And so I don't know what kind of, what we can expect at Las Vegas. I'm not sure it's going to be the same as what we've got in other jurisdictions. We'll just have to wait and see.
And as we find many times, the feelings in Elko, Vegas, and Reno often differ tremendously, and we draw a different crowd just because of the region we're in. And I know it's not going to be an easy meeting, but I think it's going to be something that we can work on, and we'll come out of there with some recommendations we can bring back to the commission. It is our full intent out of that committee to come out of the Las Vegas meeting with some direction, enough direction to give staff direction to start drafting regulation to meet some timelines through LCB and posting regulations that we will be taking final action on updated trapping regulations and at the June meeting in Tonopah. And that's why we decided to have an April 5th meeting in Las Vegas, just to make sure that we can meet those timelines and get stuff to and back from LCD. So that's, unless somebody else has a question on the trapping committee report. Seeing none, we'll move on to agenda item 8H, litigation report. Mr. Ward.
May it please, Mr. Chairman, Harry Ward, Deputy Attorney General. I have nothing further to submit concerning my litigation update. I provide support materials, which is on the NDOW website, and the support material can be requested by anyone through NDOW. I don't think it's at the back of the room now, but I have nothing more to report.
Okay, thank you. With that, we'll move on to agenda item number 8I, Bighorn Sheep Management Challenges. Is it another PowerPoint we need to get up?
Please, if you would.
Okay, I can tell everybody, we are not going to be taking another restroom break. We're getting pushed on time here. If anybody needs to use the restroom, you're on your own to go and come back. So we're gonna keep going, and we're gonna get through this soon.
Forward, back. What you got?
I need to look what it was. Yeah, I seen it.
Okay. Well, no,
We have to switch back. But I mean, we can't really quite figure out. Who's here? Yeah.
That's what I do. Just keep waiting. Everybody knows what it's supposed to be.
Need power?
no.
Okay, so you're presenting and he's pushing.
No, we're both presenting, but he is pushing. Do you want to?
Yeah. How's everyone doing out there? Okay, with that awesome response. My name is Mike Cox, the game staff biologist for Nevada Department of Wildlife.
Perry Wolf, wildlife veterinarian from the Nevada Department of Wildlife.
Thank you all for sticking around and hanging in there. We've got actually a pretty important topic to bring up about our ability to sustain our bighorn herds. And we're going to really focus on diseases. The agenda talked about some other issues out there, but it's really going to be focused on disease risks to our herds. So our current challenges with respect to herd sustainability are our great connectivity of our herds and the broad distribution of our herds that actually we helped greatly contribute through our highly successful bighorn restoration program. So something that was a goal of ours has now become a challenge, and we'll explain that more in detail throughout the presentation. We've got a lot of habitat carrying capacity limitations that we've talked about before. Drought is not going to go away anytime soon. We've got water developments drying up. We've got overgrazing from feral horses, our own sheep, and in some instances livestock. And what we're going to focus on tonight, which is diseases, big challenge. And related to that is the uncertainty of what to do once a herd becomes inflicted with a disease, and how to manage it from there. Just real briefly, one big thing I wanted to pull out from our history of our bighorn restoration program, excuse me, we attempted to reintroduce sheep away from risk of disease contact, which was primarily known public land, grazing, or trailing allotments. But that was not always avoided. We also had hold harmless agreements. Some were written, some were handshakes, letting the landowner, the permittee say, look, we were considering putting sheep within 10 miles or so of your allotment. If something happens to those sheep, we will not hold you responsible for that disease event, the die-off, whatever may ensue. But I think in doing that, we sent off a wrong message that disease was not a big deal, die-offs weren't a big deal, and that we're living that being played out 30 years later. So we're going to be going back and forth into our GIS maps that show us a ton of information that we've been collecting over time, both from the animals' movements and from the pathogens that they have. So with trying to explain this whole connectivity of our herds statewide and how our success of our restoration program has become a challenge, the layer that's up now is all domestic sheep, permanent allotments, both Forest Service and BLM, statewide. And it's a pretty big swath through the central part of the state. And just to kind of show you that though we made attempts to try to move sheep, reintroduce sheep away from those risks, we certainly have areas that did not do that. We've got herds you can see that are adjacent. Some populations that were adjacent had animals dispersed into active sheep allotments. Same thing happened up in north central Nevada. So even though we tried, we did not necessarily succeed in trying to find places away from these disease risks. Something that has become more and more apparent to us recently is something that we really didn't think of, I don't think, back 20, 30 years ago, and that is, even though Nevada is over 80% public land, there is still a lot of important and pretty productive private lands. So the blue is all the private lands in the state of Nevada. And if you look from a bird's eye view, like let's say central Nevada, you're thinking, well, there's not a lot of private land. But every one of those little parcels, whether it's 5 acres or 1 acre, can potentially harbor a hobby flock of domestic sheep or goats. I'm just going to pan into the south end of the Toyabes. Many of you have been to Peavine Canyon, just one of many little meadow complexes associated with all of our mountain ranges. Private parcels in the bottom, well watered. Our wildlife want those resources and want those waters. And we have a bighorn herd in that Peavine Canyon. And so another example that is kind of timely is the Santa Rosas, Paradise Valley. We all know how highly productive the Paradise Valley is. We just had 3 weeks ago an incident of, Tony in fact mentioned it in the report, of a Soy exotic sheep from Scotland that got away from its owner near the bottom of Martin Creek here, went up into the Santa Rosas and commingled with our California bighorn herd. That, I think, happens a lot. And in fact, many of the die-offs that we've had over the last decade, when we start to look at those, I think more and more of those could have a higher probability of having a private farm flock, hobby flock source vector than a public land allotment. In this case, we did avert a disaster, but it could have easily turned ugly. One of the things that, again, we've done so successfully is restoring all these herds, and we filled in a lot of gaps. And something that we've been doing more and more is putting out GPS collars, trying to figure out how far these animals move. I'm just going to give you a tip of the iceberg of information that we've gathered to kind of show you the distances that not only a bighorn move, but some of the domestics. We're going to zoom into central Nevada, Monitor Range, and the Tequima Range. Highway 6, Tonopah. This in itself is something that is becoming more common. Brand new herd, transplanted itself into self-transplanted itself into the South Monitors. We weren't sure where it came from. At least I think now we know where the rams came from. There was a ram that we satellite collared. He went on a 55-mile walkabout, went through the Monitors, through Hunts Canyon, actually went down downtown Belmont during daylight hours, made his way up Meadow Canyon, eventually up to the North Summit at over 11,000 feet on top of the Tequimas. Then went all the way down to Moores Creek. So that actually, we're starting to document that kind of a movement more and more. Panning out, many of you know already, it's been years and years and well talked about, is the movement of the Rockies from the Rubies. And sure enough, we had 4 rams and DNA data to support a 110-mile movement from the Rubies to the White Pine Range. And in fact, we had our first detected hybrid. We had a 5-year-old hybrid killed last year in the White Pine Range that was half rocky and half desert. But not only is our rams moving a large distance, when we get stray domestics, they also sometimes go on a walkabout. We had 3 years ago a domestic ewe and lamb come out of the Antelope Range on a public allotment in central Nevada and go over 50 miles down through the Hot Creeks and into the Pancakes, and was detected commingling with a herd of sheep during the hunting season. We had another instance, just one of many, of in East Walker River, sheep off the Gray Hills with the Raptor 7 Ranch, had a Scrappies tag, went all the way down to the East Walker River, to the Elbow, if you're familiar with that, and we did get permission to remove that sheep. So you can see with the connectivity of our herds that we've been filling in through our successful program, and then these movements, really 20 miles is almost nothing anymore to know that these animals are going that distance. We have some real issues, and this buffer that I'm going to put around all of our herds, to me, when I first did it, it really made me think hard. And it's pretty scary to think that 20 miles, and again, 20 miles is not all that far with the data we've been collecting. You can go from the southern tip of South Nevada all the way to the Oregon border, potentially having animals moving and obviously pathogens moving. And in fact, this big gap, we showed that we had rams go right through all that. So 20 miles is nothing. So that is something that's really, really serious. We need to try to deal with more. And the magnitude of the die-offs is kind of the next place I want to go. So we've had several die-offs over the last few decades, and I think this connectivity is just going to exacerbate that and increase the chances of that happening. 2 years ago, myself and my counterpart in Montana put together a workshop on post-die-off management. We did a survey of all the western states and provinces to see what all of us had lost. We went back to the 80s. This is not a graph that you should be proud of, that you're at the highest level. That's Montana. Montana's lost over 3,500 bighorns since the 1980s, and unfortunately we're next at over 2,000. Colorado was approaching 2,000. We really think with connectivity of our herds and the information that Perry's going to present on where we've detected these lethal pathogens, that there is very strong probability that that 2,000 is going to rise, and we need to talk about how we can reduce that threat of that rising.
So if we look at, Mike's going to show is just a map where we have sampled sheep either with known die-off or where we think we have some herd issues going on, and where we've come up with this bacteria, Mycoplasma ovonemoniae, and that's all of these little red areas across here. And Mycoplasma ovonemoniae kind of has gained some new traction. Mainly, it's not a new disease, it's always been there. It's naturally carried by domestic sheep and goats. The problem is that historically there was a lot of focus on Pasteurella, and the reason is that Mycoplasma ovonemoniae is a very fussy organism, does not like to grow well on a petri dish. And we've really been able, with newer technology, PCR, some organism-specific testing, we've been able to look at it recently and actually find it. It was always there before, but we could not recognize it. They've gone back historically and looked at tissues from, archived tissues from back in the 80s, 90s when we started seeing these bighorn sheep diseases, and with newer technology, they've been able to pull MOV out. It's part of the bighorn sheep pneumonia complex, but I think that what is striking to me is that when we look today with our die-offs that have occurred since I've been here, everywhere I look we find MOV. When we go back and look historically, and some of these die-offs are outlined here in yellow, Hayes Canyon, we had tissues left over from there. We were able to take them and resend them back in and look for the organism, and again, we found it there. So it was there. We've gone back and looked at the die-off in 2003 from the Santa Rosas. We've now discovered that, yes, there was MOV there. They knew there was pneumonia. They knew there was Pasteurella. But everywhere we look, where we have historical tissues and can go back and pull them, we're finding that Mycoplasma is certainly a very significant player in all of these die-offs. The sheep range, which crashed back in the 80s, 27 years ago, and has never recovered. We went back as part of a USGS project there, and we were able to recover MOV from current animals and show that it's still a prominent organism in that herd, with a large percentage of those animals still infected. So what's the problem with Mycoplasma ovonemoniae? One of the major problems that's coming to light is that these animals can remain carriers for years and years and years. Hell's Canyon up in between Idaho and Washington and Oregon is probably one of the most well-studied metapopulations of bighorn sheep that has disease. They've been studying that group since 1997. They have 16 herds, which I think about 14 of them have chronic pneumonia. And in all that period of time, they have not been able to clear pneumonia from any of those herds, and none of those herds have cleared it themselves. They even had a group of ewes sheep that got down to 7 ewes and were totally isolated for 2 years. They introduced a clean ram, and within 2 months he was dead. So they obviously are not able to clear this pathogen. The bad news is what happens is there is poor lamb recruitment. They've shown where they've had a couple of years of good lamb recruitment, and then it goes back down again. They may have a couple of more years, but overall, the populations are stagnant and not increasing. And actually, what Mike's going to show you what we've now even found in some of our own herds as far as lamb recruitment.
So we'll focus on this metapopulation that's surrounded, we're centered off the Pancake Range. These bar graphs represent lamb recruitment, relative lamb ratios, pre-2011 when the pancakes experienced a die-off. So if we look at the pancakes for 4 years, again, kind of normal, between 30 and 40 lambs per 100. In 2010, precipitous drop in 2011, and then in 12 and 13, essentially no lamb recruitment in those two herds, yet there's still well over 100 ewes in that herd. And if you look at this metapopulation, they're responding differently.
And we don't, that is something that, this is all the same strain type of MOV that's isolated. We've gone in there and tested them. And that's one of the things that is not well understood at this point, is why do some herds appear to do a little bit better after diseases, after a die-off, and some linger with poor lamb recruitment for years and years. That's something that's being addressed. One of the things that's recently come to light is this concept of this chronic carrier state. Where they've identified in studies of herds with MOV is basically 3 classes of animals. After a die-off, after the animals everything is settled down, they find some animals that either appear to be resistant to infection, or if they do get infection, they're able to clear that infection continually after being resampled and resampled and resampled. They never appear to shed the organism. There's another class which they're calling the intermittent shedders. In those animals, they'll test them 1 year, every 6 months. One time they'll be positive and shedding the organism, and one time they'll be negative and shedding the organism. They don't know if they're becoming reinfected and shedding, or what exactly is going on. Then in the other class are these chronic shedders, and when they sample them repeatedly, they find that they're always shedding over and over and over again. What they feel is that it's probably those are the animals that may be keeping the infection circulating amongst the herd. And what's so, what's so devastating about this is that it's, these herds will struggle with lamb recruitment issues for decades. They've had herds up to 20 years in Colorado that have had poor lamb recruitment until the last die-off survivor died, and then they kind of bounced back. So what happens is the lambs are born healthy. So it's not that the ewes aren't getting pregnant and giving birth. They're going ahead and doing that. What they think is happening is these chronic carriers are either infecting their own lamb, and then when they get together in these nursery groups, then it's like someone bringing the cold to kindergarten class. Everybody gets the infection, and usually in the northern breeds, they're seeing lambs starting to die almost like clockwork, between 4 to 6 weeks of age. They've in Hell's Canyon, they've gone in and actually harvested shot lambs at 10 days of age and found them to be infected with MOV and showing signs of pneumonia. And they've actually gotten the organism out of the lambs at 4 days of age, which probably means they've been picking it up from their mom, who's a chronic carrier. Yeah, so we want to talk about the ideal die-off, which we've had one of in Nevada that we know of. And we wish all of our die-offs actually would be like this. The ideal die-off occurred in Hayes Canyon in 2007. And that was an all-age die-off, pretty much all animal die-off, where we lost all 110 or so sheep pretty much at once. We monitored that for years. We're able to find very few survivors, any at all. There were sort of ghost sheep reported. years and years and years. We waited 7 years and then finally did not find any survivors in there. And then we were able to repopulate that mountain range with clean sheep. So that was great. We got rid of everybody all in one fell swoop. And it would be great if the rest of our die-offs were like that. However, that's not the pattern that we've seen since then, unfortunately. We'll talk a little bit about the snowstorms, which is up north central Nevada, which had a die-off that started in 2011. We lost about 70 animals there, all age. And one of the major issues with that is that our own sheep connectivity came back to bite us. We had translocated some ewes up into the Calico Mountains, and thank goodness that they had some satellite collars on because they decided they didn't like it there, and moved from that location down into the snowstorms where they became infected. We went in and harvested 2 of those animals and found out that the ewe had MOV, was shedding it, and that the lamb actually had pneumonia. So we know, it's been well documented, and we now have it confirmed here, that these bighorn sheep can, once they're infected, we know they move, we know they can transmit, they can take the pathogen with them when they go. So that is, again, another landscape liability. Something that gets, I think, even a little bit scarier is if we want to go over to eastern Nevada and talk about the situation in the Rubies and East Humboldts, where, as you know, we had a pretty major die-off where we lost about 90% of our bighorn sheep in those 2 mountain ranges in 2009 and 2010. At the time, we sampled some of our mountain goats, and for the first time confirmed that Mycoplasma ovipneumoniae can also infect mountain goats, which was not known before. This led to the experiment that we are currently conducting, where we removed all of our surviving bighorn sheep out of the East Humboldts and transplanted some naive bighorn sheep from Alberta, collared those animals. We've been collaring and studying our mountain goats to try to determine if mountain goats can act as now a chronic carrier of Mycoplasma ovipneumoniae and then give it back to the sheep. So now we have, if you look at the green dots, those are the movements of collared bighorn rams. The blue dots are our mountain goats, and certainly we don't know if there was interaction, but there's a possibility that they were interacting in time and space. We know that mountain goats and bighorn sheep will have nose-to-nose contact, and we also know that you can contract MOV between animals that are housed in pens 40 feet away. So it does not take nose-to-nose contact to transmit this bacteria. So now we'll skip down to, I think, a regional issue. As you know, we've had this summer, California had discovered a die-off down here. We have gone in and sampled and found MOV in a number of our herds here. If you want to go to the slide. So we know we have MOV in the River Mountains. We have had sick animals there. We've documented it in Spring Mountains, McCullough Range, El Dorados. They found it in the Old Dad Complex. They found it down here below Highway 40 in the Marble Mountains. In November, Arizona did a large, massive survey effort up and down on their side of the river. They found MOV in Arizona and the Black Mountains. And again, the behavior of sheep is coming back to haunt us. This is a dendrogram of the strain types of MOV. These yellow ones these are all of the ones that are on a similar line are the exact same strain. Here's the strain that we got out of our Nevada sheep, out of all the mountain ranges we sampled down in the southern part of the state, Nevada. They got the exact same strain across the river in the Black Mountains in Arizona. When you look down here to the red, those are all the strains. That's the strains and the sheep that came out of the Marble Mountains and Old Dad, so all the same strain out of those 2 mountain ranges in California. And then if you look over here on the screen, you can see that again, this is the Spring Range down below in the yellow. So we have the exact same strain that they found in California in the Marble Mountains, and Old Dad has now moved up into the Spring Range. So we now have 2 strains one that's crossed all across Nevada. We have one that's now is coming up from California, and we feel that either it started in Arizona and moved over, or our sheep moved it over to Arizona. I think if you look at this map, what we're all pretty terrified about is the fact that we have the Muddy Mountains, which is a population of very close to 1,000 sheep sitting right in the middle that are currently, the last time we sampled them in November, clean and disease-free. However, it's not a very long walk from the River Mountains over to the Muddy Mountains. And that could bump us ahead of Montana in the sheep loss tally pretty quickly.
Yeah, and what do you do with that situation? We went actually down to Southern Nevada, met with all of our biologists last week. We talked about many of these scenarios and what is doable, what is maybe effective or not, what is palatable to the masses out there, and there's not a lot of options. I mean, I guess we could depopulate the River Mountains, and that's not going to go over well with Boulder City, the Park Service. But anyway, it's some very, very hard decisions to be made.
So where do we go from here? Now that the Southern Nevada issue is really a regional issue, one of the things that we're trying to do is pull together California, Arizona, Nevada. We've got managers, geneticists, veterinarians. We've got a lot of people that are involved in this in each of the states, and a tremendous amount of data. If we put our heads together, can we come up with a way forward? We can't deny it anymore. There's connectivity between all of these groups. There's also question about whether MOV might behave differently in desert bighorn sheep. It's been highly studied in Rocky Mountains and California bighorn sheep, but there's been very little studied down in the desert populations. And we're hoping that with their different life history, that maybe it will act a little bit differently. Maybe we'll get pockets of lamb recruitment, we don't know, because they don't tend to cluster up as much. But that's some of the questions that we want to answer, and hopefully we can pull that together as a regional effort. We also are looking at going back to the theme of the chronic shedder. There's a study that's being put together in South Dakota right now, where they're actually trying to determine if they can, with pen studies, if they can reliably take some of these sheep from these diseased populations and really flesh out, are there animals that are resistant? Do these intermittent shedders do they just shed intermittently, or are they being infected and then they shed and then they clear it? And looking at these chronic shedders, and if you mix those different classes with lambs, do you see a difference in lamb survival? We'll be coming to the commission to ask permission, I like that, to potentially send a group of sheep from the snowstorms, which is a fairly newly infected herd, to participate in these types of pen studies too. In concert with that particular study, they are also in the Hells Canyon ecosystem looking at potentially trying to drill down to this chronic carrier issue in the field. And that is something that we think might be worthwhile to try in Nevada. That study that they're doing is a 5-year study, and I don't think personally that we have 5 years to wait to kind of sit around thinking about what we might be able to do. We're looking at some different herds and thinking, is there an area where we could try to identify at least some of these chronic carrier animals? We do have areas where we've gone back in and resampled. What would happen if we started culling them? Maybe culling some of these small populations where we think they're very close to moving next to a clean herd. Those are some other projects that we're trying to look at doing to see if we can somehow start putting some action on the ground to stop this from covering the entire state of Nevada and not having any bighorn herds that are disease-free.
We can't sit on our hands, although some people want to throw their hands up in confusion. We can't do that either. we have to try to move forward with whatever we think maybe have the most efficacy and try something to prevent the spread. I just want to maybe kind of finish story that in this pancake metapopulation, Mike Podborny re-released sheep into the White Pine Range in 1999. That in itself, we may have maybe would have done something different now if we known what we knew today back then. When he went out and monitored the movements of those release complements in the White Pine Range, within the first 6 months, we had dispersers to the Duckwater Hills in the center of this active domestic sheep allotment. And in fact, not only that, but there's a trailing route where they move a lot of the sheep, and know the operator that moves the sheep all the way up to the rubies. Then we had movement. Well, he wrote in his reports for 2-3 years straight, Houston, we have a problem. Are we going to do anything about it? And it fell on deaf ears. And it fell on my deaf ear. It fell on the region's deaf ear. We didn't do anything about it. We let it go. These dots are a 3-year-old ram. You can just see what happened next. They went into the North Pancakes. And then they made their way all the way down to the main pancake herd. And we know we have movement between the Grant Range and the Pancakes across Railroad Valley. So this is just, and we talked about the Calicos, Mountain, Santa Rosas, and the snowstorms. We can't any longer allow us to bury our head in the sand, allow this transmission, and then years later come up with these poorly performing herds that can't even recruit enough. They're gonna become this landscape liability, and we really need to try something, because doing nothing is the worst thing we can do. Anything else? That's all we have. Questions?
I'm curious as to whether or not you're seeing this where the resources are becoming limited. Is there an environmental factor associated with this, or you're seeing it throughout? It doesn't have anything to do with the habitat or the environmental stressors, that it's so widespread that
we're seeing it in the desert herds that are in drought conditions. We're seeing it in the most productive herds in the north at higher elevations. It doesn't seem to be. But the one thing we do acknowledge, and other western states also acknowledge, the more sheep you have, the more young rams you have. And the more young rams you have, the more movement you have, and the more potential for connectivity and transmission.
And we also have found, we have some of these herd outbreaks, we found a domestic sheep in the middle of the group. So, and that's the natural host for Mycoplasma pneumoniae. So, that makes sense that that's where they're